Last night we covered an introduction to what is parish health and then spoke about some of the obstacles that lie in our way, defining 4 common barriers to parish health. This evening we're going to turn our attention in a positive way towards how we can go about developing health in our parishes with this first talk, part 3, the umbrella of parish identity or culture and its relationship to leadership. Well, in this talk, we turn our attention towards the steps we will, each of us, need to take to address parish health, the obstacles, and the cure. And what I want to do here is begin by, looks like, there we go. What we're going to do in this presentation is talk about 2 things found in every parish. These 2 things overshadow and protect everything, hence the use of the word umbrella in this talk. They are parish identity or culture, and for the purpose of this presentation, we'll drop the term parish identity and only use the term culture and leadership. And what I hope to do in this talk is show how culture and leadership are linked. So to begin, let me clarify what I mean when I use the term culture. For many of us, the term culture is a word that's too narrow in our understanding. For our particular setting in Orthodox parishes in America, it often refers to a specific ethnic designation. For example, the parish may be Arabic or Greek or Russian. But if we are serious and want to have a serious conversation on culture, we're going to have to broaden our understanding of the word and disconnect it, not totally, but to a degree, from the meaning we give to it of ethnicity. This statement of mine should not be taken in any way as a critique of any one ethnic culture, because that too would be too narrow of an understanding. So I'm going to tell you a story. It was our first Pascha, or Easter, together in the new parish of St. Spyridon. I'd been in the parish about 8 months. And it was the first time we were conducting the midnight service, the vigil. It had just come to a close, and I came out from the altar to distribute the red paschal eggs. And wait a minute, I thought to myself, many in our community, in fact, most, had never received a red egg before. Instead, at the close of a liturgy, they were expecting the andidoro. So I stopped myself and said to those gathered, okay, everyone, listen up. Tonight as you come forward, instead of getting andidoro, the blessed bread, from me, I'm going to give you a red egg. Now, before I could continue, several hands went up in the church and questions started pouring out. What? What did you say, Father? A red egg? Why an egg? Hold on, I told them. Let me explain. I'm going to give you an egg tonight, not bread, because it's Pascha. And as we break the fast and celebrate Christ's resurrection, the tradition of our church is to hand you a red paschal egg, red for the blood of Christ, and as you crack your egg and eat it, you'll notice the white on the inside, which represents the resurrected life. Additionally, the fast is over. We can eat eggs and meat again, and we find life inside the tomb, and the egg is a type of tomb. Got it? Oh, and one more thing. When you come up, you and I are going to crack one another's eggs using the frame, Christ is risen. And the response, truly, he is risen. Well, as I finished my explanation, more hands went up in the nave. Wait, what are you going to do? Could you go over that again? What are we supposed to say when you give us the egg? Now, can you imagine having to teach people on Pascha to say Christ is risen for the first time? Now, I continued to answer their questions, but then there was one more. Father, what do you do with the egg after you crack it? I smiled at them. Eat it. Oh, was the response. But then one more question. Father, what do I do if I'm allergic to eggs? Another pious member of our new parish shouted out, put it in your prayer corner. With that, there were no more questions. Let me say that when I look back on that experience, I realize how much of what happened that first Paschal Vigil was being defined by the emerging culture of our mission parish. Notice hand in hand with worship was teaching. Notice how parishioners were engaged and felt free to ask questions and seek understanding. Notice how the parishioners were open to implementing something new that they didn't yet know about the faith into their lives, after many of them hadn't seen a red Paschal egg before, after all, nor had they exchanged the greeting of Christ is risen. And finally, notice that although I had only been there a few months, there was already spiritual growth. They knew and had prayer corners, even though most of them were not yet Orthodox or had just become. So let me provide for all of you a shortened definition of what culture means in a parish. Now, you'll see the image of a stew, and that's a pointed reference to what culture does. It takes a number of different things, it puts them together, and slowly out comes one entity, a stew. So the culture of a parish is made up of its set shared of ideologies, its philosophies, its values, its beliefs, its behaviors, its traditions, its attitudes, and norms. Now keep in mind that all of these are influenced by, yes, our ethnicity, but also our social background, our education, our economic status, our politics, and our demographic diversity. But together they form the culture of the community. And you need to remember that a parish's culture is stronger and larger than any one of the elements that comprise it. So this means the culture of the parish is the strongest and therefore most powerful force in the life of the parish. So powerful, in fact, that it can obstruct or facilitate the preaching and the reception of the gospel. Now, having defined the culture, let's try and understand it a bit more. Well, how many of you can remember your first sleepover? Well, I can. When I was young, my mother let me sleep over at my friend Gar's house. And in fact, until then, I had never slept anywhere except my own home or my grandparents' home or a relative's. And so I remember the experience vividly. It was the first time I was away from home and not staying with, as I said, a family member. And when my mom picked me up the next morning and asked me how my sleepover went, I told her about eating orange macaroni. I'd never had mac and cheese. And I told her how I ate a salad, but it really wasn't a salad. It was just lettuce with creamy stuff on it. It was an iceberg salad with ranch dressing that came out of a bottle. I had never, as a Greek, eaten a salad like that before. You see, macaroni and cheese and iceberg lettuce with ranch dressing were not things that I, in my very ethnic Greek home, had ever eaten. In fact, I also told her how I had a black and white cookie and orange cereal, Captain Crunch. What was also crazy to me was that we ate in front of a television without parents. All of this was very different from my home and my culture. The story illustrates the profound impact culture can have, not only on how we live, but on those who visit our home, our parish. And so, just like me, a first-time guest to our parish is also encountering our culture and all that our culture is powerfully directing. Now, we should understand that parish culture is dynamic. It shifts over time, and that parish culture is a naturally occurring outgrowth of the interpersonal interactions and decisions that have occurred over time in our community. In my friend Gar's house, the relationships within it, with his mom and dad and his brother, and the decisions his parents had made over time had developed a certain culture within their home. And this culture dictated things like what we ate and how we ate it. The tricky thing is, culture is created one way or another. And most importantly, whether we are intentional or not about its creation, It exists. So whether we're guiding the culture or not, it is affecting us. So we need to recognize and be aware that while the parish culture we operate within is alive and developing, and it is also like a patina that develops over time. Now, earlier you remember in our first talk, we talked about the multidimensional definition of parish health, and I'm going to summarize them for you again. Number one, a personal commitment to Christ and the gospel, a connection between the gospel and daily living, the creation of an interconnected social fabric of family, and excellence in our day-to-day operation. Well, not long ago, I met with a new couple in our parish, and this is something that I do all the time. In the culture of my parish, when someone new shows up, there are several people who immediately begin meeting with them. So I asked this new couple, Duffy and Lori, tell me about your experience thus far at St. Spyridon. Now again, this was not very long ago. Now here is a summary of their answer. Father Evan, we have to tell you that we have been searching for some time for a church that could meet us spiritually and introduce us to Jesus Christ. Duffy, the husband, was a Buddhist. And after attending here, some of my co-workers, this was now Lori, his wife speaking, have been asking me what I've been doing since I'm changing so much. So notice already in their response, we hit the first part of parish health, which is a personal commitment to Christ. And in the second, in their answer, we've hit the second, which is the gospel showing up in our life. Lori and Duffy went on to say, our children are grown. And I should say that we have for some time been looking for a new family, and we feel like we found one. So that social interconnection. Finally, it seems that things are run rather smoothly around here and organized. We hit the final element of parish health with their response. These statements by a new couple to our community confirmed but spoke about the culture they had encountered, a culture that we had developed intentionally through the interpersonal relationships and decisions we have been making over time. All right, so to our slide, now I realize that most of us inherit a parish culture, and only a few like me get to be part of its early formation. Yet every priest, every parish leader, and every parishioner and guest deals with and adds to the culture of the parish. It isn't fixed. And let me share one of the most important points of my presentation. The difference between healthy communities and those who are struggling is that healthy parishes, and specifically its leaders, are asking themselves again and again, what is the culture of our parish and how can we positively guide it? So you'll see in our boxes we've listed, we inherit and influence parish culture. All of us do. Number two, parish culture is the product of every personal interaction, and I should say decision in the parish. Number three, the green box on the bottom left, healthy parishes examine, think about, and positively influence their parish culture. When is the last time your parish had a conversation about its culture? When's the last time a council meeting was directed totally about the culture? And finally, the last box, healthy parishes never underestimate the impact of their culture. So I have to tell you another story about Pascha. It was a few years later as St. Spyridon was getting started, and this time the church was full, and we had seen tremendous growth over the following years. In fact, we started to get even cradle-born Orthodox who were in the area from overseas but attending the university nearby. They were coming for major feasts. And so here we were, and it was Pascha. The church was full. And after the initial singing of Christ is risen, when we hand out the light, those cradle-born Orthodox who were visiting the parish, not members yet, left. Now, one of our newer members happened to be sitting next to a group of them from Cyprus, and he became rather confused by their departure. Why were they in such a hurry to leave? Hadn't the service just started? We hadn't even had the Eucharist yet. Now, the next day at our Pascha barbecue, this is part of the emerging culture of our parish. We hold this because most of our parishioners do not have family that are Orthodox and nowhere to go. So after Agape Vespers, which is full, we then have a barbecue. This man who had been sitting by those guests from Cyprus came up to me and said, "Father, why did all those people leave after we sang Christ is risen for the first time?" Now I had to explain to him that in many parishes, the Orthodox who visit for this great feast of Pascha don't stay for the liturgy. Instead, it is their culture to leave right after they receive the light. "Oh," he said, "I guess I didn't know we could leave." Now, why did Daryl say that he didn't know he could leave? Although it's kind of funny, the truth is that is not the culture of the parish of St. Spyridon, but it is the culture of many of our parishes. So rather, the culture of our parish leads parishioners to a deep engagement in worship. So let's go to our next slide. So culture is important, as you've been hearing me say. And healthy parish leadership thinks about their own culture because they know that parish culture defines and guides everything we do. And this is happening explicitly or subconsciously. The culture is guiding how the people in the parish live and operate. If we were to go and ask those people from Cyprus, "Why did you leave?" they wouldn't probably be able to articulate the reason why. Now, the bottom line is a healthy parish leader understands that its culture drives the decisions and actions of all members, so it pays attention to it. I've made this point several times, but I'm going to keep making it. Healthy communities then live with the adage that what we practice and what we value becomes permanent. So we better pay attention to what we are doing. Ultimately, we know from experience and from study after study on organizational behavior that the culture of the parish determines its overall performance, its growth, its vitality, and how it either does or does not live out the Great Commission to baptize all nations in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. This is why, and I've put the phrase at the bottom, Peter Drucker famously quipped, "Culture eats strategy for lunch." This means that anything we attempt to do as leaders and any great plans we develop, like a building project, an outreach ministry, a focus on worship and spirituality, a new ministry creation, will be effective only in as much as the culture which it is in allows it to do. So let's move on and say a word about parish culture and its benefits. Now, if you look at this, I think you're going to see that there can be a very positive impact from culture. And here's some of just a few. I mean, the list is quite long, and I list just a few of them. It increases morale, commitment, and teamwork. It decreases waste and conflict. It improves decision-making, efficiency, performance, and operation. And it maintains the values that we hold while building a transcendent structure. Now, some of you are probably not familiar with this phrase, transcendent structure, so let me explain it for you. If we desire to see sustained health in our communities, we must work diligently on building a healthy culture. When that happens, as I just mentioned, we will be building at the same time a transcendent structure for the parish. A transcendent structure is something that lives beyond the current leadership or moment. So I told you yesterday how our metropolis has a parish health ministry, and that all of the parishes are part of developing parish health plans and becoming healthier. But some of the parishes in our community are incredibly healthy and have been so for decades. So I want you to think about building this culture that's transcendent, that's healthy, and think of it as a trust fund that keeps paying interest but never depletes the principal. Of course, a transcendent structure works both ways. So we have to notice, is our culture positive and therefore positively influencing our parish over the long term? Or is our parish culture negative and having the opposite effect? Understanding this helps us understand why some parishes go from glory to glory and others seem to constantly muddle along. So, okay, the list of benefits sound great, but the thing to remember is when you are working towards parish health, then you also develop the right culture. It's not like you try and increase morale or decision-making or efficiency. No, this is not the goal. Rather, it's a byproduct of the right culture. Now, when I left for St. Spyridon's after my 5 years at the first parish I served at, I decided to interview some accomplished parish priests, an abbess, a couple of mentors, my spiritual father, and even some professors from my time at Holy Cross. At the time, 13 years ago, I didn't know that I was after parish health, if you'll recall from my first presentation, but nevertheless, I asked these people, explain to me what things they would emphasize if they were starting a church. Now, I kept those interviews, and in retrospect, when I review what they said to me, they were all talking about culture. They intuitively knew, although they could not articulate, the benefits of the culture of a parish. Okay, and so the truth of the matter is a healthy parish knows that the culture will guide the work of the priest. You know, it's not unusual to find a parish priest who, in arriving in one parish, has a rather difficult time, whereas in his previous parish, he flourished. This is often the result of a cultural problem. So the culture guides the work of the priest. It guides the parish council. It guides ministry leaders and parishioners. In fact, it guides the quality of the interactions between all. When you don't attend to the culture of your parish, you busy yourself with lists of rules and do's and don'ts, and this is a tedious business and bears no fruit. In reality, it is the culture that determines the quality of the interactions that occur inside the parish and how the parish interacts with the outside world, not a list of rules or regulations. So if we are healthy, then we are concerned whether that culture is the right culture. The last word on culture. So in thinking about cultural change, because that's something that I am driving at, you know, when you think about this umbrella of culture, you have to understand that if we're going to implement a parish health plan, then we have to begin to attend to the culture. But you have to take a step back and realize we start this process by first examining carefully ourselves in our community. And in presentation 4, I'm going to outline the exact steps, but I want you to know that part of your becoming healthy starts with a self-examination, careful, critical, and honest of ourselves. This reflection is something, and especially something, the leadership does. The leadership knows how important and slow movements around culture need to be. And so this is a sidebar. You know, leadership, if it's developed, if it's mature, knows that moving culture too quickly is a massive mistake. You know, you can't make quick changes in culture. In fact, a developed and mature leadership recognizes that culture is deeply ingrained in people. And it takes a great deal of time, conversation, careful thinking, and explanation to see and understand our parish culture and to recognize its strengths and weaknesses. I want you to think of the difference between turning an aircraft carrier and a small speedboat. To turn an aircraft carrier takes miles and miles of ocean and a great deal of coordination. This means leaders and those who work with them to change culture can easily create expectations that are impossible to realize. So instead of reacting and making quick decisions, leadership must have an understanding of the time and the attention that it is going to take to properly address the question of our parish culture. Now, some experts say that it takes approximately 7 years to alter the culture of an organization. And that only 7%, and reason that number is so small is because most people don't persist, but only 7% of those who try are successful. Now, my experience tells me that that's about right. Now, earlier in our talk on barriers, I mentioned one of them, which I labeled autocracy. Well, a sign of an autocratic parish is something I labeled in that talk as the daddy parish. Now, a daddy parish is not necessarily a bad thing. We have so many of them throughout the US, and some function rather well. The problem is that a daddy-run parish, which relies on a central charismatic figure who guides, directs, and orders everything and is adored by most, leads to an unempowered and disengaged laity. And this over time is unsustainable. That's because the success of a daddy parish lasts as long as the leader that is leading the parish is in place. At the same time, daddy parishes, and there are daddy chapel hybrids, that's another type of barrier to health, are common to startup communities or new projects. So listen carefully. That is to say, it is a naturally occurring phenomenon in any startup or new endeavor, right? To have a daddy model come up. In other words, whenever something big happens, we have a startup, and the specter of a daddy or a chapel-led structure can creep in. And I want to tell you how this showed up at St. Spyridon's. In my 5th year, the parish had grown tremendously. And we were firmly a daddy parish. If I said to do something, the people listened. If I was at the meeting, it occurred. And if I didn't show up, no one else did. Constantly the refrain, "What does Father say?" was echoed. Now, about that time, through self-reflection and new learning on the art of leadership, through coaching, which we're about to get into, along with further study on the meaning of parish health and culture, as well as organizational behavior, I realized where we were. And after some thought and planning, I announced in a set of talk sermons and parish assembly meetings that we as a parish were now going to head away from a daddy-led parish to an empowered ministry model. Now, I don't have time to get into what an empowered ministry model is. I talk about this in other talks, and you can imagine, however, right now, the structure. It's the opposite of the autocratic parish. Now, I'm in my 13th year, and we started this in my 5th year. And I can say we have fully embraced that shift in culture. We have not taken our attention off of this shift. And however we experienced resistance or sabotage, we kept at it. We noticed that the resistance and sabotage was not only in ourselves, but it was in the people we were leading. But the astute leaders in our community, when considering how they go about adjusting culture, kept asking, what in our parish culture can be leveraged in this process? And this led us to continually focus on the strengths of our parish culture, and over time, as we mentioned yesterday in the talk, continue to prune our weaknesses. All right. All along, good leaders are aware that the desire to alter things quickly can raise the resistance to change to an unbearable level. So as we were trying to go through this change from a daddy culture to an empowered, engaged culture, we were constantly assessing where the parish was, its leadership, its membership. And it was a little bit like a chef who's overseeing, a large kitchen, who moves from pots and adjusts the temperature up or down and tastes and adds spices. We talked about in our first talk that parish health requires skill and artistry, just like a cook. We know the ingredients we have to add and the approximate amount, but there's also the gut, the intuition, and we have to pay attention to it. All right. Now, let me remind you, for those of us who ignore parish culture or say to ourselves, we better leave it alone, let a sleeping dog lie, we do so to our own detriment. You can't ignore the changes going on around you, nor the changes that need to be made. And I have to tell you, not far from this church is the Kodak plant. Now, some of us remember Kodak. It's now one of the largest shuttered plants in America. And I want you to know something. In 1975, Kodak invented the first digital camera. That's right. They invented digital photography. So what did they do with this industry-altering technology? Nothing. They didn't see the revolutionary nature of their own discovery because of its culture. It couldn't envision a change in how people took pictures and in the makeup of their business. They were no longer tied to innovation. And as many of us know, Kodak doesn't really exist anymore. Now, obviously, Jesus did not ignore culture. Instead, he fostered culture constantly with his disciples. Perhaps a good word from our tradition for this is phronima, that is, the mindset or the outlook, okay, that we carry as being Orthodox. All right, so let's go on. Slide number 10. You know, to lead cultural change, that's what we're now going to start talking about, because we've talked about culture, and I hope I've given you enough of an understanding of its importance, its value, and its influence. But we need to talk about now leadership, all right, and how leadership interfaces with culture. So let me state emphatically that if you didn't know what the purpose of the leadership of your parish was about, let me tell you right now that its job, its job, is to lead the culture of the parish. That's what parish leadership does. To do this, okay, a leader begins to become aware of the imbalances that exist in their parish culture. And we all have them. Even my parish has them, and we're constantly paying attention to them. And they set their sights on discovering the true vision of their parish's culture. Think back to the example I gave in moving through barriers of regaining sight and the blind man in John chapter 9. These leaders then lead the learning and the change that prunes these imbalances and brings greater health to their parish culture. Now, the hard truth that all of us learn at some point is that no one is born a leader of culture. Instead, it takes work because cultural leadership is learned and developed. So I'd caution you here, listen carefully, because before attempting to address the culture, leaders truly have to have a metanoia, okay, a repentance that is a change of mind about who we are and how we are doing things. I think you probably know by now that the first public words of Jesus were repent. So a metanoia, a repentance, is required in our leadership. We have to know that we can't make this journey of cultural transformation if we as leaders remain entrenched in our current state of mind. You know, time and again, as I visit the parishes at the request and the blessing of my metropolitan and begin to talk about cultural change, the leadership says, Father, that's not the way we do it. The leadership itself is resistant to making changes. In fact, several years ago, I got a letter from a former parishioner who wrote to me thanking me for the many ways I had served them at the parish. They had moved away now and were living in a different city and attending a different parish. But yet they were looking back fondly and comparing their current situation to their former. Now, instead of being wrapped up nostalgically in what they said to me, as I read the email, I noticed several attributes that they pointed out and lauded that I now knew to be disfigured. It was an interesting snapshot, if you will, into my past, into who I am now. And as I wrote back to them, I told them how much I appreciated their kind words, but also how much I had changed and how their letter encouraged me to continue to do so. If that is true, then leaders are constantly seeking to learn the art of leadership. This is a sign of health. In this process, we strive for self-awareness, becoming self-detached, and thus able to evaluate our thoughts and actions objectively. That's exactly what we do in the process of repentance. We gain greater and greater emotional and spiritual intelligence. Now, please note that this may be the silent killer when it comes to leadership development and implementation, when we are not self-aware. And as one church growth expert, Todd Bolsinger, in his book, Canoeing the Mountains, wrote, highly recommend the book, the challenge in front of leaders is the long tutorial of trial and error, of observing and interpreting and experimenting. It requires us to be changed and attentive to our own resistance to change. And personally, it requires me to embody the transformation needed and to invite others to join me. So let me pull up this slide. Let me tell you a little bit about what it means to be a developed leader. A developed leader thinks deeply about their role and what needs to be done in the life of the parish. I use this word develop because I think so often we just talk about leadership, but there are good leaders and there are bad leaders, and I'm going to distinguish them by saying a good leader is a developed leader. So a developed leader establishes the general culture, the character, the direction, attitude, and tone of the parish. He guides the cascading stream of vision and mission, strategic goals and SMART goals, which we'll talk about in our next presentation. A developed leader develops a plan of execution, and he understands, or she understands, their own strengths and weaknesses, then recruits and builds the right team while building congruency and ownership of the vision and mission. Finally, a developed leader reviews, assesses, and tweaks in a timely and appropriate manner. And I would say, a developed leader gets help. They don't imagine that they can just go at things on their own and they don't need any help getting where they need to go. Now, if we're serious about developing our leadership, then a healthy parish invests in the developing of its leadership at every level. So in my parish, we spend time at every parish council meeting, at every ministry leader meeting with staff, developing them. In fact, one of the offices of our parish council is a development office that looks solely at leadership. And we hold annual parish council retreats on leadership. We bring in guest speakers who talk about leadership. Leaders are developed, and it's a learned skill and a journey. And so, we have to be aware of the need to constantly implement leadership training. Now, some of the attributes that you'll find in developed leaders is courage. Some of us may know the story of Captain Winters. Famously, his life in World War II is outlined in the great book by Stephen Ambrose, Band of Brothers. He was a man of great courage, and because of it, his followers, his platoon, would go literally into the jaws of death. Great leaders have character. They are people of high moral fiber. But most of all, they have integrity. In other words, they know right from wrong. They encourage others to do the right. And they also do the right despite the risks that might pose to themselves. Developed leaders have internalized their learnings. It's not a put on for them. They've become what they've learned. And that's why I've got an icon of the three hierarchs, up. They're emotionally intelligent. If you don't know anything about emotional intelligence, I'd recommend looking at a book by John Gottman called The Emotionally Intelligent Child, Raising the Emotionally Intelligent Child, and learning. I've got a whole lecture on emotional intelligence, but I have to tell you that our parish health team, as we assess leadership, often finds that the failure point is emotional intelligence. Attributes of developed leaders is that they think. They think, then they act. They don't just dig ditches. They're not just, men and women of action. Oftentimes, when I was learning about this, my leadership coach would say, Father Evan, you dig ditches deep and wide, but they don't have any direction. You know, you just pick up the shovel when there's a problem and you start digging and you dig a ditch and off you go. But you need to get out of the ditch and look and think before you act. You know, great leaders take appropriate risks. They're risk takers when it's right to do so. They're nimble, meaning that they can pivot. They're humble, meaning that they always work within a team and see the best in others, and they're flexible. We'll keep moving. Now, the role of a developed leader is one of a shepherd. And I think having the image of Christ, the Good Shepherd, in front of us is helpful. You know, the shepherd leads the sheep to good pasture. This is the idea of health that we've talked about in our previous presentations. He also protects the sheep from wolves, and this is the elimination of barriers, or the putting up of the right barriers, which we talked about again last night. He knows the sheep, which is culture, which we talked about just recently, and then he guides them to the fold, which is the role of guiding the culture and the community. My last comment before we take some questions and take our first break is to say that, look, there is a systemic reality to our parish's health. We're not sole actors. And so I've put up the Synaxes of the Saints of America because I recognize that unhealthy practices are developed and sustained not just within our parishes, but in our dioceses, within our archdioceses. And real work is needed at this systemic level. And often when I give this presentation, there are hierarchs in the room, as we have Sayidna with us tonight. And I encourage our bishops to realize that they have to maintain a sustained pressure on developing healthy culture and leadership if we are to tip over into the realm of not only healthy individual parishes, but healthy dioceses and healthy archdioceses. You know, leading towards health is the role of all developed leadership, not just in the parish, but at the diocese level. So I thank your board for looking to add this conversation to the diocese. And yet at the same time, it requires the diocese to give systemic support and guidance on what it means to develop a healthy parish. All right, this is the life work of our parishes and of our parish leadership. I'm going to move to our last slide, and I think Father Joseph, you mentioned earlier, and Khalil, you did as well, that they all have a Q&A box that they can use. Caitlin, a great question. In our next presentation, we're going to talk about creating our parish health team. And one of the tasks of that parish health team is to work through a conversation around the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, the barriers that are existing in our parish context, and to develop a team that is demographically and idea diverse, and using a conversation covenant. That's a resource that Khalil, I can share with you, and you can get out to the parishes, that you will use to help those conversations. It requires stakeholders who are engaged and care to sit and have a conversation in which they're honest, they're respectful, they're open, they're trusting, and they're accountable. It's not magic, and oftentimes what people want is someone to come in from the outside and assess, and I would tell you, be wary of such an assessment because they're not going to know the nuances or the history. It's really something that has to be done within. Now, part of this is also our own personal journey of a repentance and just coming to terms with the fact that we probably have some element of blindness, you know, like Mr. Magoo, that old cartoon. And we need to be aware that we have some blindness, and you'd be amazed how quickly the scales fall off.
Thanks, Father. The next question is anonymous. It's is it important to be American?
You know, I'm going to guess a bit of what they mean by that, and And perhaps what they mean is to be an American Orthodox parish. Is that what your guess would be, Khalil, as well?
Yes, I think so. I think in terms
Yeah,
of removing
yeah,
ourselves from our Lebanese or Greek or Russian
Russian.
identities.
Hmm. You know, we are in a particular setting within the United States where we came to the U.S. and many of our parishes were established under a certain ethnic umbrella of culture. What I can tell you is that those ethnic umbrellas of culture um, have many positive attributes to them. I mean, let's quickly recognize the contributions of these cultures and the power. These are Orthodox cultures often, and so there's a lot to be gleaned and kept. But I think many of us, if we're honest, also face the obstacles that these cultures have placed. I not long ago was at an event with some members from my parish. One of my lead chanters is ethnically Japanese, and she was with me at this event. It was a broader Orthodox event, and I ran into a woman that I know who is Greek, that I grew up around, and she came up to me and she said, with her beautiful Greek accent, "Hello, Father, how are you? I never see you anymore." And I said to her, "Evangelia, it's so great to see you." And she noticed that there was this woman standing beside me. So she turned to her and she said, "Oh, hello, honey. Who are you?" And she said to her, "My name is, Jenna." And I won't say her surname. It's a Japanese name. Um, and the lady Evangelia said, "Oh, you Greek?" Now this woman, this beautiful woman in my parish, looks very Japanese, and she was kind of shocked by this question, and she said to Evangelia, "No, I'm Japanese." And this woman, ignoring that she was Japanese, said to her, "Well, that's okay. You look Greek," as if only a Greek could be part of the Greek church, quote unquote. Well, obviously, that type of barrier and restriction, which I talk about in the upside down funnel or an unbalanced identity, is very dangerous. And, many of our parishes are reaching third, fourth, fifth generation and have yet to embrace the surrounding culture and context. Here at St. Spyridon's, we have carefully shepherded our culture. While our roots are in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, we are an American Orthodox parish. 90% of my membership was not Orthodox 13 years ago. And so if I was to insist at the Pascha barbecue that we only have Greek food, which is what I grew up with, it wouldn't fit. And instead, there are elements of other people's culture. Now, we can do that without defacing or demonizing the culture we come out of. And that's the hard work that the leaders of the parish have to go through. Now, I can tell you, resistance and sabotage to moving away from Lebanese culture, Greek culture, Russian culture runs very high. It's a sacred cow. And woe to anybody who touches it. They will be smitten and struck dead. But if we don't attend to this quote unquote elephant in the room, you saw that slide earlier in barriers with the mouse holding up the elephant. If we don't attend to this, what we do notice, as I pointed out in the symptoms, is that we shrink over time, we become irrelevant, we become parochial, insulated, delusional. Our own people, quote unquote, our own children and grandchildren don't attend. I can remember giving this presentation in Detroit, and as I talked about culture, a very proud Greek man stood up and shouted and screamed at me. And as I calmed him down in love, I asked him, "Dear sir, tell me, are your grandchildren, are your children in church?" And he said, "No." I said, "Why not?" And he says, "Well, they tell me the church doesn't speak to them." And I said, "At the parish that you attend, is it conducted in English?" He said, "No, everything's in Greek, as it should be." Well, his grandchildren don't speak Greek. So there's no way that they're not interested in Greek dance classes. They're not interested in food festivals. So, Khalil, I'm maybe going beyond what this question asked, but I'm trying to paint a picture that shows us, yes, there are attributes of our culture that we should honor and include, but we do need to move beyond monolithic culture. Remember, the golden age of Byzantium included all cultures, languages, and backgrounds. You know, St. John Chrysostom was not Greek, as many Greeks like to think, right? And there were many who are great saints of the church that came from all sorts of different backgrounds.
Thanks, Father. The last question, and then we'll get back to your presentations, from Joel. It says, I hear you speak about diversity of thought and perspective as a key feature in parish health. Speaking as a convert, part of what brought me into Orthodoxy is its resistance to compromising the faith. Okay. How does parish leadership remain open to diverse perspectives while not being open to changing what should not be changed?
Great question, Joel. I'm so thankful you asked it, because you're setting me up for the next presentation. Part of what we recognize in leading the change and accepting demographic and idea diversity is we're not talking about theology. We're not talking about the faith. And I'm going to illustrate that in our upcoming talks. Of course, the strength and power of Orthodoxy, I was telling you about the Lilly Foundation and those 29 parishes besides the one Orthodox parish, right? There's 29 Christian communities. And I told you, you know, we all agreed on sort of the elements of parish health, but as an Orthodox priest and an Orthodox community, we had something none of them had. And that is the constancy of our faith, of our traditions, and our teachings. None of that is up for grabs in this idea of demographic or idea diversity at all. But what I'm pushing towards in, for example, demographic diversity is saying, look, healthy parishes have old, young, middle-aged, teens, babies. They've got all demographic ages, right? They also have people from all sorts of educational backgrounds, social backgrounds, political ideologies. They've got Democrats and Republicans and centrists and libertarians and independents. They've got people that are wealthy, people that are poor, people that are middle class. They've got Blacks and whites and Hispanics. I mean, I've got people in my parish whose first language is Spanish, right? Who were born in Mexico, right? I've got people in my parish who come from, you know, Eastern Europe. I've got people from Western Europe, from Central America, right? But we also have people who come from different idea backgrounds, right? Whose approach to the world is not the same as mine. That doesn't mean they don't share the same faith. It's not that they don't agree to the fundamentals and the dogmatic formulations of the church. But they see the world differently, and that's important and vibrant, right? We don't want to be monolithic, just as, again, the great fathers of the church were well learned, right? They had been exposed to and experienced the wide variety of thinking and thoughts. And Orthodoxy too long has been ghetto-sized. You know, it's become parochial, and we need to break out of that.